You know, it's hard to believe that this game is already 13 years old, at least at the time of the making of this video. I mean, where does the time go? You know, I do have a little bit of nostalgia for this game too, which that in itself should be enough to show that it's been some time. I was living on my own, no cable, no internet, just a couple of games and my Wii, and this is one of the games I actually played, you know, during my time on my own. And that being said, I actually never even finished the game. Blob is a 3D platformer that was developed by the now-defunct developer Blue Tongue Entertainment, and was published by THQ, with the game being platform exclusive to the Wii. It was launched in late September 2008 worldwide. Blob was received very positively overall, even though around this time, 3D platformers were well on their way out the door. These days, where 3D platformers are only starting to get some wind in their sails again, Blob is a very good example of what can be taken away from in a modern 3D platformer. Okay, plot time. The game takes place on the planet Radia, the home of the Radians, but more specifically, the metropolis of Chroma City. A planet and city that thrive on beautiful and various colors and fun activities. These activities consist of skateboarding, playing basketball, going to concerts, and that's just to name a few. However, the game begins with an alien race known as the Inked that invade and take over the entire planet along with its inhabitants. This is known as the Inked occupation, where inhabitants are made to do the jobs that the invaders assign to them. There's no color allowed, along with any of the aforementioned activities. Essentially, it's a dictatorship, and there's no shortage of buildings that have been converted into some sort of propaganda station to brainwash the Radians and steal their color, turning them into Gradians. Anybody else getting any North Korean vibes? But where there's an evil oppression, surely there's always a hero. And that brings us to the Blob, along with a ragtag group of other Radians known as the Resistance. These characters are met at the beginning of the game. Their names are Professor, I guess, Biff, Artsy, and Zip. Each of these characters play important roles throughout the game and are pivotal to Blob's progression through each stage. I'll go into more detail a little later though. So there's a total of 10 stages. Each stage has its own setting and tends to be more difficult than the previous stage, as to be expected. So before you begin a stage, you pick a specific mood that determines the soundtrack that will be played during your playtime of the stage. Something else that I really like is that, for each mood, there's a particular instrument that corresponds with whatever color Blob is, and when Blob colors an object, the instrument will play along with the cadence of the overall soundtrack. This actually kind of reminds me a lot of the soundtrack in Banjo-Kazooie, how the soundtrack is dynamic and changes depending on what area you're in, but still plays the same track. However, not all the moods are available at the beginning of the game. Each mood is unlocked after finishing a stage. That being said, you can really choose whatever mood you want, regardless of the stage. So the main objective of each stage is to get to the end. However, it can be a little bit more complicated than that. You begin stages that have an almost absolute lack of color and are predominantly monochromatic. As far as the plot's concerned, you're tasked with applying color to every single thing in sight. Buildings, mountains, bridges, signs, billboards, cars, blimps, lights, trash!
Total fucking garbage!
This is to rebel against the Inked occupation. You get a score based on everything you did in a stage, and pretty much the more you do, the higher the score. Of course, one could care less about that kind of thing, but really, with the aesthetics of the game, you're just being begged to color everything you possibly can in sight. Now, this is something that is relatively optional, but still very beneficial, and pretty much a requirement for someone's first playthrough. Each stage has a time limit, but there are a multitude of challenges peppered throughout stages that reward you with extra time once you complete them. The Resistance members are found throughout the stages with these groovy looking arrows pointing towards these manhole covers or whatever these little sewer flap things are, where they jump out of when you activate their challenges. Artsy's challenges mostly consist of painting buildings or structures a specific color or a series of colors. Zip,
Useless fuck!
We'll have challenges that mostly consist of racing down a predetermined path that's lined with flares to get to the end. These seldom times do serve the purpose of revealing a route that can show an alternate path that gives you opportunities to paint more of the level, or will even show you how to get to different sections of a stage altogether. Biff's challenges are pretty much just beat-em-up missions that require you to defeat a certain number of enemies in the time limit. Prof, or Professor, who is essentially the brains behind the operation, provides missions that involve taking back landmarks that the Inked have converted into different types of propaganda stations, prisons, or facilities that dump ink into canals or other bodies of water that assist the Inked in removing all color. All of these missions have different tiers of difficulty. 1 star means easy, 2 stars means medium, and 3 means hard difficulty, respectively. Also, some missions aren't made available until after reclaiming some parts of the area, by which of painting, transform engines, or even completing other missions beforehand. Also, just a nifty little trick as a side note. If you're doing a mission and, for example, liberate and color a group of Radians and collect a time bonus from coloring them, not only does it add more overall time you have to complete the level, but it also adds the same amount of time you have to finish the mission you're doing when you collect the time bonus. After getting a high enough score in a stage, a transform engine will appear, which helps increase your score once you activate them, but also permanently changes an area in a stage that Inked can't get back, and there are usually several in each stage. There's 3 main colors that you can get by attacking paint bots, which are either red, blue, or yellow. These bots are neutral and serve just to provide Blob with paint. Of course, with the colors available, you can make different colors by mixing base colors, i.e. getting a blue paint bot and becoming the color blue, and then attacking a yellow paint bot, which will turn Blob green. Each paint bot provides 10 color points, but there are big paint bots that provide 30 paint points each in later stages. Blob can have a max of 100 paint points, and with every structure he paints, he will use 1 paint point. This also applies to when you're attacking enemies. However, the number of paint points to kill an enemy is dependent on the type of enemy you're fighting. Also, being exposed to water will rinse Blob, making him colorless, but the longer you spend in the water, the more paint points you lose. You'll never go under 10 points, however, if you're in the water, but this does put you closer to death, because if you were to take any type of damage after the fact and reach 0 points, you'd lose a life. So the paint points essentially serve as your ammo, your capabilities of how much you can paint, as well as your HP. It should be no surprise that there is actual ink in the game too, and to touch it will ink Blob and will lower his paint points at a fairly rapid pace. To add insult to injury, for every colored structure that you touch while inked, it will also erase whatever color there was, and you'd have to paint it again. While inked, you can also accidentally kill Radians, so there is a sense of dread when trying to platform around areas with lots of ink due to the fact that your life drains relatively fast, but you can also undo a lot of the work you've done while trying to recover. The only way to recover from being inked is to get to a body of water to rinse Blob off. The point behind the plot of the game is to reclaim Chroma City by returning color to everything. Along with this, the inhabitants, known as Radians, have also been enslaved and are assigned jobs that are determined by the Inked Empire to help augment the rule the Inked have made. Since Radians too have had their color stolen, the game refers to them as Gradients, and saving them is also just one of the many general missions that you have in stages. So along with rescuing Gradients, you can also paint all the trees that you'd find in a stage, color 100% of the level, reclaim all the landmarks in a stage, collect all the styles, which these are meant to provide texture to surfaces that are painted, otherwise they would just be a static color. There's also a certain number of billboards to paint in a stage, a blimp to color, transform engines, and all the challenges from the Resistance members. You can get a bronze, silver, or gold medal depending on how high a score you get. However, if you are making an effort to complete the level, you'll get a gold medal long before you actually finish the stage. There's a fair amount of enemies throughout the game. The basic enemies are Inkies. They aren't very dangerous and cost 1 paint point to kill. Heavy Inkies are armed with guns connected with packs of ink and can attack at a short distance. They cost 10 paint points to defeat. There are also Inkies on jet bikes. They try to ram you, but also leave leech bots behind, so they're fairly dangerous if there's at least 2 in the immediate area. They cost 20 paint points to dispatch. There are also stationary turrets that can fire consecutively at far distances and cost a massive 50 points to take out. Probably the most unique enemies in my opinion though are the Elite Inkies. Despite being Inkies, they're color-coded and have to be defeated by being attacked while Blob is the same color as they are and take 4 color points to be defeated each. I find these enemies to be the most difficult generally because they show up more than halfway into the game, but become fairly commonplace over standard inkies. But beyond that, they're always in groups and aren't segregated from other colored squads. So oftentimes you'll see a group of 5 red elite inkies and 5 yellow elite inkies, and they'll rush you simultaneously, merging their groups together. Blob can only attack by targeting with Z and making a downward flick of the wrist with the Wii remote, but you can't pick a specific target when they're all grouped up. Oftentimes I just find myself swinging the remote frantically, hoping I attack the inky matching the color that I was. And of course, with all the elites there, if just one of them hits you, you'll still get inked and need to rush to a body of water to remove the ink. In conjunction with this, there are usually a fair amount of elites in a group, and each one does again take 4 points to kill, so it's not uncommon to get inked with a relatively low amount of points to begin with. So anyways, with each stage you clear, you get closer to reclaiming Chroma City and overthrowing the inked. With every stage, there's a cute and charming little pre-rendered cutscene. It's very functional too. It not only serves as progression of the story, how the events unfold where the resistance is attempting to retake the city, but also gives the player some insight as to what to expect in the upcoming stage, oftentimes new enemies. For a lot of you, seeing this game I'd imagine reminds you of Splatoon. I'd probably say the same thing, but at the time of the making of this video, I've actually never played Splatoon at all, not even a demo. But there are still other games that remind me of this as well. One I can name immediately would be Super Mario Sunshine. Although instead of trying to get rid of all the goop, ink, paint, and so on, you're the one causing it. Another game it reminds me of a little bit with the gameplay as well as in terms of character motivation is the Jet Set Radio series. Pretty much going around and tagging up the city and fighting off the Dracovian police as a form of rebellion against the mayor who is always taking away people's rights like freedom of speech. Not a far cry at all from the same premise in the Blob. This game isn't without its cons though. Once you're towards the end of a stage where you're trying to finish getting everything that you may have missed, you can have a fairly hard time trying to do so. It's not a major problem, but it is one that players will come to notice, some more than others. The compass does help to alleviate this issue a little bit when it comes to finding what buildings are left to color, but stiles, billboards, gradients, and trees, just to name a few, can't be located with the compass and have to be looked for just by actually searching the stage. With the numerous textures and colors along with all the bouncing colorful radians running about, it's almost impossible to spot a billboard that has yet to be colored. These in themselves are still minor issues and are ones that only arise from someone looking to be completionist and often occur once you're ready to end the stage anyhow.
Are we ready?
This video has been brought to you by
Raid Shadow Legends.
Well, I must be close to the Armageddon.
Being a 3D platformer, there are times where the camera's position can change and that can affect mid-air platforming. This can be troublesome at times when attempting to complete a challenge with a time limit. The problem is that there are times where you can't jump because you're on a particular face of geometry in a stage. Whether it's because you hit the wall at a funny angle, or there's something beneath Blob preventing him from sliding down the wall to hit the ground, the game seems to think that Blob is still in the air and can't be made to jump again until he touches down at a ground surface. You can frantically wiggle the joystick on the nunchuck to get out of this, but this isn't without its frustrations, because this happens usually when you're trying to jump from one block's worth of buildings to the other to gain height to more easily reach buildings that need to be colored. This is especially annoying when you're trying to color a set of buildings in a mission, and of course, all these missions have a fairly short time limit. Reasonable, but not without a hitch when this issue takes place. Since we're on the topic of platforming, as in most 3D platformers, we must discuss the dreaded environmental hazards. Environmental hazards show up a little ways into the game. Hot plates can burn Blob if he touches them, and you need to turn them off with timed switches. The biggest problem is that if you're hit by these, you drop 30 seconds of time that is deducted from your overall time limit that is needed to beat the stage. On top of that, if you don't recover the time dropped within a few moments, it will disappear and you won't be able to pick it back up. Another environmental hazard is the electric plates. You also turn these off by hitting switches as normal, but if you get hit by these plates, you lose a life the same way you lose a chunk of time. As well, if you don't recover the life, it too will also disappear. Not everything is out to kill you though. There are also environmental augmentations that help Blob traverse some otherwise unreachable areas. There are these things called Z-pads, where Blob can Z-jump from one pad to another. Again, they're just a means of getting to areas that Blob couldn't get to otherwise, but in rare cases help Blob traverse a large area, also serving as a type of shortcut. Along with this are air cannons. Air cannons are found fairly later on in the game. They're used to traverse fairly big distances. However, they're really no different in use to Z-jumps, and for that matter are actually less capable than Z-jumps, as Z-jumps can themselves be used in reverse. The cannons feel more like they're put there to put you at a distance from where you use them, only to pad out the level as you find your way back with platforming. This is of course due to one wanting to paint everything in the stage and wouldn't want to risk missing anything by being sent past real estate in the stage with the air cannon. Platforming does get a little bit more troublesome in later stages of the game due to the game's obstacles becoming more ambitious to augment the difficulty, something that is typically normal in most other 3D platformers. This gets harder in some ways that are unfair though. The camera can couple with this problem as the camera tends to be very independent and wants to give you the best angle possible in certain, oftentimes more cramped areas. However, it doesn't always work, which shouldn't be a surprise. And this isn't even that bad, considering that there are other bad cameras out there. I'm looking at you, Blinks.
I'm sorry, I'm thinking about cats again.
But what it comes down to is that the platforming gets harder with more narrow ledges, the camera can get a little too restless, and continue to pan to and fro of Blob, but what really brings it home is the sometimes spotty jumping controls. You have to flick or bob the Wii remote to get Blob to jump. It isn't all that bad to be honest, but in situations where all these things come together at the same time, it does turn it into a very quick to frustrate situation. There are also some surfaces that can cancel out Blob's ability to jump. This is in place most likely to prevent players from cheesing their way through parts of the map to make it to the end by jumping over otherwise impassable walls. And that's fine. But there are parts in certain stages that you actually have to get to areas like these to get transform engines, builds to color, trees, or whatever. And sometimes Blob can't negotiate that area well because as a player, you can't discriminate between what constitutes Blob's footing being allowed and what doesn't. And even at this part right here, I got hit with ink, but because the camera and the platforming decided to transpire against me at the same time, it ended up getting me to lose a life. Could have been worse, but it was still frustrating when I was frantically flailing the Wii remote up and down like an idiot, all for it to be in vain. At the very end of the game, the last level, Lake Radia, you will spend a short amount of time in a dock-like area before landing on the main ship that actually turns out to be a spaceship. Honestly, I wasn't expecting these things to be aliens, but whatever. That actually gives it worth mentioning that if you're trying to do a completionist run by getting 100% paint on all levels, this level and the previous one, the Ministry of Ink, have a little bit of a headache that I'm gonna try to save you from. In Lake Radia, once you get past all the boats to cross onto the main ship, you'll take off into space and won't be able to go back unless you start the stage over. So make sure you are thorough before crossing the water. This isn't too much of a big deal because the bulk of the stage takes place on the mothership and the beginning area of the stage isn't really too much to do. So if you take off then, you'll know then and there that you can't get whatever was in the stage previously to the ascent. But again, it is pretty obvious at that point. However, Ministry of Ink is much different and it can be very disheartening. You can go through the entire stage, and this stage isn't easy. You have numerous amounts of enemies and the majority of the stage constantly has running ink on the walls that you have to be careful to avoid. You have turrets as well that are always shooting in again. Even if they don't hit you, the shots will decolor anything you may have already colored, which affects your progress when trying to complete the stages. My point being is that at the very end, once you've dealt with all this mentioned, there's a bridge that will collapse and upon its collapse doesn't return to normal. And at the time of the writing of this review, there is no way back in case you color everything past the bridge only to realize, such as in most cases, that you need to backtrack to color something you missed. And the compass doesn't tend to point out buildings that need to be colored until you make it to the end of the stage, at least in my experience with the game. Between the two final stages, the Ministry of Ink is way more unforgiving than Lake Radia due to the fact that you can basically get softlock from completing coloring the stage at the very end of said stage. A little pro tip though for those of you interested. before you get to the bridge. Make sure that you have 87% of the stage colored before you get to the bridge, because that's pretty much 100% of the stage before the bridge part. The remaining 13% is past the bridge section. Something I want to note as well is when this happened to me, I looked through some forums online to see if there was a way around this. The only thing I saw was that if you jump off the bridge before it collapses, then you could take out all the inkies at the bottom and return with the cannon and go back up the bridge. This, however, is false, at least again in my experience. If anything, it made the situation more unforgiving. It essentially softlocked me at the bottom of the reservoir. Since the bridge didn't collapse, the air cannon didn't open up even after I took out all the enemies. The air cannon did open up, but only after I ended up dying. So yeah, bottom line, make sure you have colored everything before these two sections for Ministry of Ink and Lake Radia as mentioned. So after everything Blob has gone through, there's actually a boss fight. And it's actually fairly difficult. So there's these hexagonal pylons that come out of the ground that surround Comrade Black and his robot Inky, and they come out of the ground for each sequence. They're pretty much all mixed colored pylons that you have to color, so it's not just like yellow or blue. You're going to be using purple, green, orange, brown, that sort of thing. It can be tough because a lot of my screw-ups were me trying to get to a paint bot and accidentally hitting a different one than intended to get the color I needed. Also, sometimes I would hit the water hydrant thing just because it was just outside of my field of view and I'd have to get the correct paint bots again. Once you hit the pylons, the robot Inky gets staggered and you gotta hit him with that sweet, sweet paint. Do that 3 times and bam, bam! After that, you basically gotta hit the last transform engine, which automatically finishes the game. The oppression brought on by Comrade Black and his Inky army has been fought back and the Radians have been saved. Everyone is happy, color has returned, and the Blob can finally catch some much needed Z's. After that, credits roll. All in all, the Blob is a great game. It's an interesting twist on the 3D platforming collectathon. Instead of coins or music notes, you paint buildings. My playthrough was initially on the Wii, the console of origin for the game. However, the game has since been released on PS4, Xbox One, Switch, and Steam, and with that, a much more traditional control scheme. No motion controls. So if you're interested in playing the game, it's widely available, and it made the HD conversion beautifully. On top of that, there's also trophy support, except for Switch, of course. Which makes it all the more enticing to collect all there is to be had in the Blob. There's also multiplayer if you're interested, but I didn't play it, so Also, there's extra missions you can do, again, if you're trying to get that 100%. There's 2 alternate missions for every level, and they're not very difficult to do at all, even if you're trying to get that quote-unquote perfect gold status. A couple of these trip me up a bit, but they're not too difficult to do as a whole, making them pretty digestible to play. You could pretty much get the whole bulk of them done in just over an hour or so.
The Blob was met with a good amount of success. It also had a sequel appear on the Wii that was also released as well on the PS3 and 360. And, just like the first game that had a multi-plat current gen release, the sequel did as well. So you can pick up the Blob 1 and 2 on any regular commonplace console with pretty relative ease.
Outside of the HD ports, there hasn't really been a true third installment in the series. The gaming climate may be to blame, but platformers always manage to come and go, so maybe we'll see a third installment sooner than we think.